So our final presenter, as I just mentioned, will be Ms. Tanya Kuzman, who is an associate with the Business Law Group at Mills & Mills. Tanya will be providing us with a briefing on the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. Tanya practices in the area of business law, advising companies as well as charities and not-for-profits on both corporate and commercial matters. This is including corporate restructuring, contracts, and transactional work. Tanya regularly assists with incorporation, corporate reorganizations, continuance, charitable registration, dissolution, and general commercial services. Tanya also advises clients on questions of governance, bylaws, regulatory compliance, and related litigation. Tanya began her career as a summer student and an articling student with Mills & Mills, and later joined the firm as an associate. Prior to joining the firm in the Business Law Group, Tanya obtained her Juris Doctor from Osgoode Hall Law School and completed her master's degree in political science at the University of Toronto and an honors bachelor's of arts in history and political science from McMaster University. Tanya has worked at all three levels of the government, including Toronto City Hall, the Ontario Legislature, and the House of Commons, and brings her knowledge of the public sector in assisting her private and charity sector clients. She's also published in the Journal of the Parliamentary and Political Law, the Osgoode Hall Law Journal, and the Canadian Political Science Review. Tanya is a detail-oriented and strategic lawyer, and we look forward to her briefing today.
Well, thank you so much, Nate, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to my colleagues for their great presentations so far. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with everybody. I've only got 10 minutes today to take you through the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. And so I am going to get right to the point here. For some reason, my screen will not, or my slides will not move to the next one. Okay, hang on one moment, folks. For some reason, my slides are not moving. So let me just try this again. Okay, so our agenda today is going to be focused on these four things. And actually, let me just start by saying this is obviously legal information, not legal advice. So if you need some assistance, particularly with respect to your situation, please don't hesitate to contact us directly. But today we're going to be providing this general legal information on the Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. So today we're going to focus on what is actually Anka. Does Anka apply to your organization? What does Anka actually mean for your organization if it does apply? And what are the next steps that you should be thinking about if you're captured by this new legislation? Okay, so I'm going to start by speaking about what is Anka. So perhaps the phrase better late than never might be the most appropriate way to start off describing this legislation. And I say that because this legislation was officially proclaimed into force almost a month ago on October 19th. But we've been waiting, almost 11 years for this to happen. We've been patiently waiting, organizations have been patiently waiting, so we finally have this dawn of a new era. And a lot of folks are now asking this question, why are we dealing with Anka? What was the point? And so what I want to say is that generally the purpose of this legislation was to modernize the laws and the regulatory regimes for not-for-profit corporations in Ontario that would actually serve to be responsive to the needs of Ontario not-for-profit corporations, clarify certain things, facilitate some good governance, transparency, and increase efficiencies in accounting and decision-making ability. So, I mean, if I put it simply, you can think of Anka as sort of like a Ontario not-for-profit law 2.0. It's sort of a better version of what organizations have been operating under thus far. So with that being said, I'm going to just move on to our next big question, which is, does Anka apply to your organization? So this is really critical, and I want to be very clear here because there may be a large group of you who are in attendance today for whom this, you can just sit back, take another sip of your coffee and relax because it doesn't apply to you. So how do you know whether it does? Anka will apply to all Ontario not-for-profit corporations and charities that prior to October 19th of this year were originally governed by Part 3 of the Ontario Corporations Act, which governs corporations without share capital. So one little trick to trying to figure out whether or not this is likely to apply to you is if the term letters patent or supplementary letters patent kind of ring a bell, and you know you've seen that in your governing documents before, it's likely that you were originally incorporated under the Corporations Act, Ontario, or the CAO, as you can see in my slide, and that Anka will now apply automatically to you. If, however, your corporation or your charity was originally incorporated under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, meaning at the federal level, then you're one of those folks who can just sit back and relax, take a sip of coffee, and hang out till the question period. But for those to whom the legislation does apply, you know, this is a very significant development in your evolution as an organization and in your history as an organization, because it will force you to confront several pretty critical changes. And so, because I only have 10 minutes, I'm not going to touch on all of those, obviously, but I am going to try and hit 3 key things that I think are probably pretty critical for you to be paying attention to right now. So a new law, a new piece of legislation, what does that mean? Well, it means new rules, essentially, that your organization is going to have to comply with. So basically, what should be top of mind right now is to look at your organization's governing documents. As I mentioned before, there are going to be some terminology changes. So you may be used to seeing things like letters patent or supplementary letters patent. You may be familiar with the terms objects. Those terms are all going to change now. So instead of letters patent, it's going to be articles of incorporation. Instead of objects, you're going to be looking or dealing with the word purposes. These things are essentially synonymous, but the vocabulary and terminology distinctions are going to be important so that you don't get confused. And it will mean some of these little tweaks in your governing documents, but perhaps more substantive than that will be, for example, changes to some of these old power provisions that are likely lingering in letters patent or supplementary letters patent of Ontario not-for-profits. These clauses might say things like the organization has the power to own, buy, or sell land, or to borrow money on the credit of the corporation. For most organizations, these clauses are not really necessary anymore. Actually, both the OCA and Anka give corporations the capacity, rights, and powers of a natural person. In terms of your bylaws, for example, Anka says that bylaws need to set out the conditions required for being a member of the corporation, including whether a corporation or another entity could be a member of your not-for-profit. If the corporation has 2 or more classes of members, the bylaw has to provide that the conditions for membership, what they are in each class, how you withdraw from a class of membership, and the conditions on which membership in a particular class will cease. So, I mean, that was a large piece of information. The point that I'm asking you to focus on here is that with a new law comes new rules and obligations, which means that organizations for whom Anka applies will have to look at your letters patent and look at your bylaws and seriously consider what needs to be amended in order to actually comply with this new legislation. And that's going to be a pretty important overhaul next step. The next thing I want to talk about, which is quite a substantial change in Anka, is this distinction that the legislation makes between public benefit corporations and other not-for-profit corporations in Ontario. This distinction is quite critical. So under Anka, a public benefit corporation means generally that either that you're a charitable corporation, so charitable corporations are automatically public benefit corporations, or a non-charitable corporation that receives more than $10,000 in a financial year from various sources, such as donations and other places, which we can talk about. But those 2 classes of corporations are going to be considered public benefit corporations. So, like, why does this matter? What's the point? Well, the distinction between public benefit corporations and other corporations is that, let's take, for example, in public benefit corporations, no more than 1/3 of the directors of a board can be employees of the corporation or any of its affiliates. Anka prescribes different rules in terms of how a corporation can dissolve and distribute its remaining property upon dissolution, depending on whether or not you're a public benefit corporation or not. And finally, and perhaps most critically, or as critical, but also significant to pay attention to, is that the level of financial review that the corporation is required to conduct. So, for example, an audit versus a review engagement is going to be different depending on whether the organization is a public benefit corporation or not. If you're not, chances are under Anka, your financial review obligations may be slightly relaxed. So it's going to be important for organizations to figure out which one they are, if they're a public benefit corporation or not, and then determine what rules apply as a result. Okay, so I know we're moving quite swiftly here, but I'm going to move on to my last kind of point that I want to point out for folks. So Anka ushers in sort of a new era of enhanced membership rights for members of organizations. Included in these changes are things like allowing members to put forward proposals at annual general meetings and special meetings. The legislation provides members with greater access to the corporation's financial records. And corporations should also be aware of the enhanced rights in terms of things like derivative actions, so dissent and oppression remedies, which sound like very corporate terms. And in many ways, they are derived from some of the for-profit legislation governing for-profit entities. What's important to remember here is that these are remedies that members can lean on when they believe that the board is being operating in an oppressive manner towards the membership, or that the corporation isn't acting in the best interest of the corporation. And we can talk, at a later date, if you give me a call, about what all this stuff means. But the point is that the legislation does usher in quite a few additional members' rights, and so it'll be important for corporations to be aware of those things. I'm almost positive that I'm out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up right now and say quickly that in terms of the next steps that you should be thinking about, Ontario not-for-profit corporations right now, if you haven't already started thinking about this, should be thinking about reviewing your governing documents. So you're, what I'm sure you're familiar with is the letters patent right now, but the new terminology will be, your new articles and your bylaws, and begin implementing those necessary changes to ensure that you're complying with Anka. Luckily, there is a transition grace period which is being given to organizations, so you do have approximately 3 years to do this. But there are consequences for not doing it within the time period, which I think we'll probably get to in the question and answer period. But it is important that these changes are made prior to the expiration of the grace period. So that's October 19th, 2024. You've got 3 years. And we would obviously encourage you to consult with counsel when you are making these changes, because they can be quite complex. So that's all for me. I think we have a group question and answer period, but should you have any other questions about Anka, how it applies to you, how you go about making these changes, where to begin, please feel free to call myself or any one of my wonderful colleagues who can provide assistance in that regard. Thank you so much.